So I'm Steve Boucher, a colleague of Michael and Travis at UC Davis, and part of this quite large team that's been working over the past several years on these questions in Tanzania and Mozambique. So, and just think the transition from what we just heard from Laura and earlier from Olaf to what we're going to talk about now. So Laura just showed us that there seems to be some quite significant yield gains from these DT drought-tolerant varieties, and the drought-tolerant traits seem to effectively protect against certain types of drought, right? Especially moderate mid-season drought based on the evidence from the farmer field trials, right? So what we're going to do now is kind of move to that last link of this evidence chain and start looking at what happens when real farmers, the types of farmers we're really concerned with when we think about issues of poverty and food security, are offered these new technologies, both in terms of drought tolerance, but also, as Michael talked about earlier, index insurance. We want to see, do these yield gains hold up, right, when we take these technologies to the real world? And you just want to think about that a little bit more before moving on. What do we mean? So what is the difference between the context and the farmers that Laura has been talking about versus the ones that we're going to be looking at in this study? Right? So clearly, in all cases, farmers are subject to pretty significant weather-related shocks to their production. But there's some significant differences that Laura started to talk about that I want to just emphasize here. Right? So as Laura said, the farmers in the field trials, they're not randomly picked off the street, right? These are typically fairly commercial farmers, good access to inputs, not necessarily subject to very binding liquidity constraints, and really importantly, as Laura mentioned, kind of the counterfactual in the farmer field trials is, what's the difference between yields with drought-tolerant varieties versus commercially available improved maize varieties, right? So that's the difference. The impact is attributable to those differences in the farmer field trials. Now, when we talk about real-world farmers of the type that those of us in the room are concerned about, right, they're quite different, right? They have minimal access to complementary inputs. Markets don't work very well for them. They lack liquidity. And the counterfactual that we're going to be talking about with these farmers is primarily the difference between yields with drought-tolerant varieties versus local maize varieties, okay, as opposed to improved varieties. Okay? And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So Michael has already foreshadowed the primary research questions that we look at. But again, so the primary questions we'll tackle here are amongst the population of vulnerable smallholder maize farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, what are the impacts of drought-tolerant seeds by themselves? And then is there additional benefit when these seeds are bundled with index insurance? Yeah. And we're going to look kind of both at within-season impacts, in other words, when you have either a normal season, a good season, do we see benefits of drought tolerance varieties? When you have bad seasons, what does the benefit of drought-tolerant varieties look like? And then really importantly, as Michael was talking about earlier, we want to look at kind of the lagged effect, right? You have a bad year this year. Does drought-tolerant maize and or index insurance allow you to recover the following year? Okay, so this is this question of resilience. So Michael has talked a lot about, or he talked quite a bit about, kind of what are the potential mechanisms by which drought-tolerant varieties and index insurance can promote that resilience or recovery from a shock, and they're listed right there. The one that I just want to focus on here is, and it's kind of obvious, but what does insurance do, right? This particular insurance contract that that our colleague Israel at Hollard Insurance in Mozambique and others in Tanzania offered, right, was its seed replacement insurance. So if the insurance is triggered, you get a payout in the form of drought-tolerant maize varieties to plant next season. Okay, so you can immediately see how that's going to promote potentially promote resilience, right? You're going to be able to, you're literally not losing your seed capital. You're going to be able to replant in these new and high-yielding varieties, okay? As Michael mentioned, we have lots of additional questions we want to tackle. We're not quite there yet. We'll share some very initial results on food security, which we'll come to at the end. Okay, so Michael has done a good job explaining the research design. So let me summarize that really quickly. We have two different treatments. The first one, both of them are marketing treatments. Right? So the first one, we're marketing drought-tolerant seeds. So Jonathan and Laura, for the past several years, went village to village in our treatment areas and held information campaigns about these seeds, described to farmers how these seeds work, what the costs are, what the potential benefits are, right? And then they literally made these seeds available for purchase at market price. Okay, so it was a marketing intervention. The second treatment is the same thing, but in addition, right, the seeds that Jonathan and Laura made available were bundled with index insurance. Okay, so there was no standalone insurance made available. So the insurance is only made available in this, the second treatment communities bundled with the seeds. Okay? And as Michael mentioned, again, the insured seed was marked up about 20% relative to the uninsured seed to reflect the cost of the insurance. So Michael already described the index insurance contract, how it works, so let me skip that. And again, this work obviously could not be carried out without a lot of different partners, including the seed companies and the insurance companies. And we'll hear from insurance companies a little bit later today. So let me just give you a sense of the sample, starting how many farmers are we talking about? About a total of about 3,000 farmers across the two countries. Michael has already described the timing. So just a bit of language. So we have 3 seasons, right? So the season, as Michael said, both in Mozambique and Tanzania, planting runs roughly from November, December, and harvest is in roughly May or June. Okay, so the seasons cross years, and so we'll refer to these as the 15-16 season, the 16-17 season, and the 17-18 season. We'll also refer to them as equivalently baseline, endline, and midline years. So basically, the nice thing about this 3-year sequence of surveys that we collected is it's going to allow us to do a couple of different things. And most importantly, it'll do 2 things. So first, as Michael mentioned, we have a fairly spatially diversified set of communities so that in a given year, we have lots of different heterogeneity in weather experiences. And then we also have heterogeneity thanks to having 3 separate years. And then having 3 separate years is really important because, as Michael said, it's going to allow us to look at the impact of a shock this year on households' ability to recover in the following year, and how that ability to recover is influenced by these 2 different treatments. So we've talked about shocks. I want to be very precise now in how we're going to define shocks, because we're going to talk about 2 different types of shocks. The first is midseason drought. We've talked about a lot for the purposes of this paper. Concretely, that means rainfall during the middle 40 days when pollination is occurring was less than 200 millimeters. So that would correspond to roughly to, as Olaf described, a moderate mid-season drought of the type that should be, in theory, protected by drought-tolerant varieties. The second type of shock is I've called here kind of awkwardly a covariate yield shock. What I want to think about this is really a much more severe, kind of widespread weather-based shock. Okay? And the way we detect this, Michael has already described it, and it's going to be picked up by satellite imagery-based predictions of average yield in our communities. Okay? And when that prediction is less than 65% of the historical average in that community, we're going to call that a large covariate shock, right, that's affecting most people. It's both severe and it's affecting most people in the community. Okay? And in fact, we're defining it like that because that indeed is the primary trigger for the insurance. Right? That's when an insurance contract would pay out. That table shows us that indeed we have, fortunately for us, unfortunately for the farmers, lots of shocks, lots of these types of weather shocks in the sample over these 3 years. And they're not hitting places at the same time. So the baseline year, which was 2016, was absolutely disastrous in Mozambique. Essentially everybody was hit by a serious drought. Everybody in our communities was hit by a very serious drought in Mozambique. So now you see 100% in 2016 of farmers were hit by the mid-season drought, and nearly all of them also suffered significant yield losses that year. So baseline year was very bad in Mozambique. In Mozambique, our midline year was relatively good, and then the end line year in 2018 was kind of average. In Tanzania, as Mike already mentioned, that midline year 2017, when insurance was actually first offered, was quite bad for a lot of communities. Okay? And in fact, a lot of our results of resilience are going to be based on the misfortune of Tanzanian farmers in that year. Okay. To get a sense for the sample, let me just focus here to give you a sense of kind of how big our farmers are, how big their maize plots are. So they're between 1.5 hectares and 3 hectares in both countries. In those bottom 2 rows, you see essentially nobody is using fertilizer, and essentially nobody has access to credit or is using credit. Okay, so we're talking about fairly marginalized farmers with very minimal access, participation in those types of markets. Let me go to the next table, which will give you a sense of take-up rates. In other words, when the seed and the insured seed were offered, what fraction of farmers actually purchased. So we can see that the upper segment of the table refers to the seed-only treatment, the bottom segment to the seed plus insurance. So we see, comparing across the 2 countries, take-up rates are somewhat higher in Tanzania, both in terms of fraction of farmers that purchased, as well as conditional on purchase. In other words, those who did participate, those who purchased, they were buying more. The other thing to mention here is we're concerned, given the higher price of the insured seed, we're potentially concerned that that higher price is going to drive down demand. Indeed, we see that a little bit, right? So the insured seed take-up rates are somewhat lower than the seed-only take-up rates in both countries, but not by very much. Okay. So I'm not going to go into econometrics. I just want to say, again, what our goal here is to say, what is the impact of purchasing and planting drought-tolerant seeds and planting drought-tolerant seeds with insurance on yields? Okay? So that's the goal. And so we have a bunch of pretty straightforward econometrics methods that you can look at in the appendix. We won't go through now. And we're going to look at, how are those yields a function of, or how do they respond to both types of treatments, as well as the different types of weather shocks that we just described. Okay? So what we're going to do is take the results from econometric estimates, and we're going to simulate a sequence of 6 different types of years, where the different types of years refer to what types of weather shocks occurred during that year. Okay? So we're going to have 6 years. We're going to go normal, and that just means there was not a mid-season drought, there was not a large covariate yield shock. Then we'll introduce a year with a mid-season drought, then go back to normal, then go to a large covariate yield shock, and then back to normal. So we had a meeting last night, and both Olaf and Travis were making sure that I mentioned this. As we look at the graphs I'm about to show you, normal is not necessarily normal. Okay? So what matters here, when we're talking about a normal year, is what happened in the year before. Okay? If a normal year was preceded by another normal year, then there's probably not going to be any lingering effects. If a normal year was preceded by a weather shock, right, then we might see right, lingering effects. And so normal may no longer be normal. Okay? So keep that in mind as we look through these pictures. Okay? So this is the type of picture we're going to look at. Horizontal axis, you can see the sequence of different types of years. And we're starting with just how do these different types of weather shocks affect the control group, right? The farmers that did not have access to these new technologies. So the control group, the average yields are just under a ton per hectare, and this is kind of calibrated to the control group in Tanzania, where yields are a little bit higher. And so what we see in those first 2 years, normal years, so average yields are about 922 kgs per hectare. We go to a mid-season drought, and we see the impact of that mid-season drought is to reduce yields by about 15%, right, or about 128 kg per hectare. We see that there's not a lingering effect, an intertemporal effect of that mid-season or moderate mid-season drought on yields the next year, right? Because we see that if a normal year is preceded by that mid-season drought, actually yields recover. Okay. We then turn to a covariate or large yield shock, and yields in the control group fall significantly, about 367 kgs per hectare, right, nearly 40%. And then most importantly, what we see is even when that year is followed by a normal year, right, there are very strong lingering effects of that large covariate shock. Right? Farmers were decapitalized, right? They have nothing left to plant, to buy fertilizer, and so yields do not recover. Right? In fact, they stay very, very low. Okay, so this is the control group. So what we're going to do next is add 2 graphs. First is going to be what happens if farmers were to purchase drought-tolerant maize, and then we'll add insurance. Okay, so here's the orange one. The blue one is exactly what we just looked at, the control group. Orange one is drought-tolerant, the impact of drought-tolerant seeds. Same sequence of years. So that we see, first of all, and this is kind of similar to what Laura just showed us, under normal conditions, there indeed is a drought, there's a yield advantage to drought-tolerant maize, and in this case, right, it's about 180 kilograms per hectare, not trivial. This is what drought-tolerant seed was designed to do, to protect against moderate mid-season droughts, and indeed we find it does that quite well. Right? Whereas the control group's yields fell significantly, we find that the impact of having planted drought-tolerant maize is to maintain, and in fact we actually see even a little bit of increase in yield here. But the main message here is that drought-tolerant maize is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's protecting farmers against that moderate mid-season drought. Jumping forward to a year with a significant covariate shock, we see that the protection from the drought-tolerant seeds is not so good. All right? So just like the control group, we see significant declines in yields when we face these severe shocks. Right? And again, as Michael said, that's not surprising. Drought-tolerant maize was designed to do one thing, but not to protect against everything. And so when you have a very severe shock, indeed yields fall. And then most importantly, what we find is that when a normal year is preceded by that very severe yield shock, in contrast to the control group, we find that if you'd planted drought-tolerant maize, you really recover that next year. Okay, so either because you had a bit of extra liquidity because the previous year your yields were somewhat protected, allowing you to reinvest the next year, but that's kind of a graphical illustration of the types of resilience we've been talking about this morning. Okay, then finally, we add in insurance. Okay. Now remember, so the second treatment was drought-tolerant maize bundled with insurance. Okay. So the real additional impact here is that insurance. Okay. So when do we expect to see a positive impact of that insurance? It's precisely in the years following a significant covariate shock. Now, you're not necessarily going to see it in that same year because you don't get your insurance payout until the following year, right? You get your seeds replaced the following year. And indeed, right, that top gray square shows that not only do farmers recover farmers who had planted drought-tolerant maize with index insurance, not only do they recover, but they more than recover. So this is Michael's notion of resilience plus. Okay, okay. So those are our main results with respect to the two different treatments. As Michael said, we also are concerned with impacts on food security, and we're not as far along in this analysis as we'd like to. Let me just point you to kind of initial results that we do have. The one that we're most comfortable is we actually just look at the control group, and we see what is the impact of food security in the year following a mid-season drought and following a larger covariate type of shock. We see significant increases in food insecurity on the order of 25 to 40%, so quite significant. What we were hoping is to see that those impacts are mitigated and offset by drought tolerance and index insurance, and indeed we see kind of the signs going in the right direction from our regression results, but we're just not sufficiently comfortable yet with the specifications. So we've got to do a bit more work on that before we are comfortable sharing those results. Okay, so just to sum up, what have we seen? So significant protection offered by DT, right? So it's kind of confirming that what Laura found in the farmer field trials translates into the real world, right, with the types of farmers that we're very concerned about in the real world. So drought-tolerant varieties, indeed, we find them to find significant protection against drought, right, without sacrificing anything during normal years. Okay? And this is in spite of the farmers that we're working with, essentially using no complementary inputs, very little fertilizer. So those benefits exist. And we found very strong impacts on resilience. Right? So farmers are much better able to recover following significant adverse weather shocks in the following years. We might go to this given time in a question and answer and discussion, but one of the questions that we're debating internally is, I mean, we've actually, if you remember that gray, the top gray square, it was a very large impact. Okay? Farmers are not only kind of coming back to their yields in normal years, but they were surpassing it. And so we need to think, are those numbers plausible? Does it reflect the types of behavioral responses that Michael was talking about earlier, underlying resilience plus? In other words, are farmers, because they're more confident, they see how the insurance works, they're actually now intensifying production even further based on having that security? Or are other farmers in the area seeing what their neighbors, right, seeing how their neighbors benefited from insurance? Are they now signing up for drought-tolerant seeds bundled with insurance as well? So these are things that we'll be exploring a bit more as we go along. And then the food security results we just looked at. So we have some initial evidence that weather shocks have very significant adverse effects on food security. But you have to stay tuned for more results on the impacts of our two different treatments. So I will stop there.
Why don't we take a few questions and comments, and then we have a coffee break, I believe, right?
Yeah, we're eating into our coffee break right now, so questions.
Drinking into our coffee break.
Yeah, coffee and questions kind of simultaneously.
Okay, but why don't we take some questions?
So you're representing the yield impacts. Do you mean by this these were total production impacts? And in that case, what if you separate it out by area cultivated versus actually the yields per acre? Or you were actually presenting here the per acre, per hectare results. Yeah, it was per hectare. So what if you look at total production? What is happening then?
Yeah, so great question. So we have separate analysis that looked on production impacts on area as well. And maybe Jonathan, you can remind me, but my impression is that in terms of impact on total area, actually there's not very much of an impact. And the other question would be on what about the impact on total seed use, right? And there's actually not much impact at all. So what we see is there's a substitution, right, of away from local varieties, right, and towards the drought-tolerant varieties.
I have a couple questions. One is there any complementarity between the DT seeds and fertilizer? And I realize there's very low adoption in your sample, but is there any complementarity there?
So
And that's probably, I probably should have asked that earlier.
that's fine. Olaf, you want to respond to that one?
Well, I mean, that's partly what we mentioned, how it performs under the good season. Yeah, so under good management, we do select in terms of that it has to respond to fertilizer as well as the other material. Yeah. So there may be some, anyway, the DT material would respond to fertilizer as good, if not slightly better, to the other material.
Okay, and then maybe one more question. So with these results, it doesn't look like there's any ex-ante effects of, let's say, the insurance. Like, it's not crowding in any of these other inputs, that the effect is only ex post. So only after the shock has occurred is there this large kind of resilience plus effect. Could you comment on that? And did you see any results like that in your analysis?
So this is what we're starting to unpack actually right now, right? So we want to see, so again, what these results are reflecting is, right, the question, what was the impact of having adopted, but in a binary sense, any or none, right? And so there's lots of margins, right, that we could imagine that adoption could be varying. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing that we want to look at, and we're starting to look at, is so just what is the fraction of the seed in the year following a covariate shot like this that's in DT versus, or improved in general maize versus local varieties of maize. And that seems to be actually the main thing that's explaining this, mm-hmm. right? So I don't have the graph here, but if you compare the control group in the year following a large covariate shock and the fraction of seed that is in improved varieties, mm-hmm. right, versus before the shock, right, it plummets, right? So there's significant decapitalization, mm-hmm. right, of the control group, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. It's the opposite with the insured farmers, right? So we see that the intensity of improved seed planting following, right, if you were insured, right, following a covariate shock is increasing, yeah. right? So that seems to be the primary margin that we're finding.
So that goes back, oh, sorry.
Yeah, if I could just add a slight bit to that. I mean, we checked, I mean, there's a bunch of, those of you who do econometrics can probably imagine the model that's behind this, but we check for that ex-ante effect initially, and we don't really see it. But that big jump up is actually, it appears there is an ex-ante effect because there is an intensification going on. But it's like people didn't really believe in the insurance, so they weren't going to say, well, I'm not going to invest anymore. These crazy people say they're going to give me free seed. They got free seed, and they go, oh, okay. And so we see of the people in the insurance treatment who suffered a major shock in the prior year, they intensify their use of improved seeds by something like 25%. So that's what Steve is saying, is there's a couple of margins. So we think there's sort of a learning, people learning to trust it, and then sort of at the end of our study, we see what, the only way to explain that gray box up there is that there's a couple of margins that more people could have started participating, which we don't really see that, but those who do participate actually they intensify within the margins, and that's why I think their later yields actually more than recover, because now they say, okay, I can take this risk on, because if I put this extra money in this year, which they did, then if it goes bad, I'll get it back.
Yeah, and as I think as Travis will talk about a little bit later this afternoon, there's learning on both about the drought-tolerant varieties, but also about the insurance, right? Mm-hmm. It's the first time these farmers have ever had access to any type of insurance, and so the typical types of learning are, will we trust the insurance company? Will payments actually be made? All of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
So one question here. Thank you. So It would be helpful to understand, someone talked about fertilizer, but would be helpful to understand, given that we're talking about maize, and given how volatile the price of maize is in these regions, what assumptions were you making or are you making around markets and price on the incentives for farmers to actually invest beyond insurance? So just trying to understand, as you looked at the following seasons, did you question whether or not price or market had an effect on that beyond insurance? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a complicated and great question. So we're not making any assumptions. So literally I shouldn't say that. So I guess we're actually making a lot of assumptions. And those assumptions are essentially that the conditions that we're describing in this sequence of years is kind of the same as reflecting the exact same conditions, right, that were present during our trials. Okay, so I guess another way to say that is kind of the impact here is let's think. So if you have a large covariate shock, supplies drop, prices rise. So are you thinking that we now have in the following year farmers will think that there's greater incentive to plant high yielding varieties? Is that what you're thinking?
I mean, if your assumption is that the price sort of has minimal impact on another crop, perhaps on maize in sub-Saharan Africa, given the volatility of the price, I would say not. So I would say if you went into a farmer household and asked them, okay, so you got insured, we had a bad season last time, 2 seasons on, your investment decision this season, is that based on the fact that, 1, you would have a fallback in case you lost, or 2, there's been great prices for maize over the last couple of years. You can afford to invest because you know your return on investment is going to be relatively high. So the question is, what were you assuming in there? Or what are we assuming in there? Are we assuming that it's a stable or price has minimal impact, which I would then question, given that we're talking about maize in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah. So that is a great question, Sammy, and just to sort of chime in on it. I mean, this is why we have a control group, and these are matched triplicates. So the interesting thing is, while we haven't investigated what people's price expectations were, nor have we investigated, we do see very clearly with the control group not recovering, that's being driven by people who are geographically very proximate and should be exactly in the same market area. So I don't think you can explain the difference based purely on price expectations, because otherwise the control group would have had a similar kind of thing. And what we see is maybe they have better price expectations, but they're unable to bounce back to take advantage of it. Whereas people in the treatment groups do, especially, again, there's a pretty strong difference in the bounce back of the insured versus the uninsured maize seeds. And all of those people, because this is a very balanced kind of study, they're sort of balanced in terms of what their price experience and presumably what their price expectations would be. So that's why we're comfortable attributing it to the treatment, because it is sort of controlled for, which doesn't mean it's not an interesting question. It could well be an interaction, and we actually haven't explored market price integration yet, but within these areas, but we can certainly do that. So let's take a last question, and then we'll do a coffee break. Sophie's giving me the evil eye.
Thank you. That was it's a fascinating study and analysis. You pointed out differences between Tanzania and Mozambique. And so this question sort of follows up to the other question in the sense that if you were to do a graph like this, just looking at Tanzania versus Mozambique, and maybe you've done that, how different would it be? The reason I ask that is because, as I understand it, Tanzania is becoming more and more seen as a major bread basket, say maize basket for Kenya. Kenyan, I've heard them saying basically that they have to admit that they're buying a lot. They're going to continue to buy a lot of their maize from Uganda and from Tanzania. And so I don't know if Mozambique has that same reputation, whether that's filtered through maize farmers in Mozambique as it has in Tanzania, and how that might affect reactions and responses.
Yeah, it's another great question. So the short answer is the way we estimated the model is that we assumed that the impacts of the two treatments were the same across the two countries. So the way that this graph would be different if we were to say, let's show this for Mozambique instead of Tanzania, the only difference would be they're going to drop much lower because the mean yields, so in Tanzania, are about just under a ton per hectare. In Mozambique, it's about 2/3 that, somewhere around 600. Yeah.
But, I mean, again, it's a great question, and the reality of the study is that we did not see sort of major yield shocks in Mozambique that precipitated an insurance payment. So while we assume the processes are the same, except, we have sort of cluster fixed effects, which are taking care of the difference in levels. The reality is that, and this is the hard part of this kind of research, Mother Nature really only allows us to recover some of these effects from the variation that, quote, naturally took place in Tanzania. We had great droughts in Mozambique, but it was during the baseline period before any of these things had been implemented. So again, that's a limitation that we just have to admit and deal with, I guess. So.